Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 8th meeting. Those of you who are newer to Keele World Affairs will be sort of trying to see the pattern. And, of course, a lot of the topics we discuss are broadly, they're global or they're geopolitical, and you can draw a distinction between the two if you look at the program. There are probably 200 different countries on the planet. I can't remember how many there are at the United Nations. Very large. Anyone want to know the exact number? Anyone know?
169.
Fine, okay. You obviously know it's a big number. We can't cover all countries, but we do periodically zone in on important regions of the world so that we get just a little bit more depth about those areas. And so I suppose so that we aren't, to be honest, so that we're not always talking about a certain Mr. Trump and a certain Mr. Putin. We do need greater depth in understanding world affairs. So tonight is a great opportunity with Dr. Avinash Paliwal to talk about India and the countries around it. You've seen his biography behind me on the screen. You've been reading about it for 6 months, and you can see that he's a serious specialist in this area. He has, in fact, written a substantial piece of work only last year, a book that explains the modern history of India in the 20th century and the early 21st century, about India and its, at times, troubled relationships, both internally and outside its borders. So no one better to give us an up-to-date impression of what's going on in India and its place in the world today. So would you please welcome Dr. Avinash Paliwal.
I was just saying that if my family comes to know how many people are interested in what I do, I think they'll find some worth and value in why I'm outside of the house when I am. So thank you so much for coming. It's truly an honor. I'm delighted to be here. The topic for this evening, of course, is India and her neighbors, friends and foes. And exactly at this point in time, the government of India has to take a very fundamental decision about one of its neighbors and whether it is a friendly or, it's in the camp of being a friend or foe, and that's Bangladesh. I'm sure most of you have seen that I think a couple of days ago, the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh has been sentenced to death because of some of the deeds that she did when she was serving as the Prime Minister from 2009 till 2024, when she was ousted in an uprising, a popular uprising, right? So, and she's in exile in India at this point in time. So the government of India has to decide that here's an individual, a political leader, one of the longest standing and longest lasting female prime ministers in the subcontinent, but also someone who took a very autocratic turn in her style of governance and politics. What must be done? Because if you keep her in exile and if you keep offering her asylum, you cannot you can't go from being a foe of Bangladesh to becoming a friend with the new dispensation. So it's a very live topic for one of the largest countries on the planet, not just in terms of size, but also capabilities. So the timing of this session could not have been more perfect. What I intend to do today, and I promise you I will not be bombarding you with slides. I want to talk, I want to have a conversation, but there are a couple of slides, one of this and a map, just so that you can get a sense of the geography. I will actually there are 3 things that I want to talk about over the next 40 minutes, right? One is, why care? Why are you here? Why should we care about South Asia or the Indian subcontinent, whatever you like to call it, right? Of course, if you talk to people in India, they would like it to be called Indian subcontinent because it gives India the centrality, the kind of, the ideational, practical, political centrality in the subcontinent. But if you talk to anyone in Pakistan, or if you talk to anyone in Bangladesh, or Nepal, or Sri Lanka, or Maldives, or Myanmar, they'll be saying, South Asia is a better term. It offers some degree of political equality. We are also countries which are very important to the region. Why should we care about the region? That's the first thing I'll kind of try to unpack. And of course, this will take us to the last 5 years as to what has happened in the region, but a little bit also a flourish of the history, right? A lot of the countries in this region became independent in 1947, 1948. The traumas of that moment are being played out on the streets of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh today, and are likely to continue to play out moving forward. The second thing that I would like to talk about, of course, because this is about India and her neighbors, whether they are friends or foes, to actually really see how does India do its neighborhood in a geopolitical sense? How do you go about managing your relationships? And trust me, India is not a very loved country in its neighborhood. You pick up any of its neighbor and you go to a street, let's say in Kathmandu, and you say, what do you think about India? And I can assure you the likelihood of a negative opinion coming out is very high. That's because of the power politics of the region. And these are also very culturally intimately tied societies. But that also makes it very politically fractious at times. When I'm talking about how India does its neighborhood, something that I'll cover is what I call the threshold principle. Don't worry, we'll come to it, how it does. And then, of course, I'll finish off my conversation with looking at the future as to what next, what is the likelihood, right? I will not keep this slide in front of me because I want you to have a look at the map of the region of what we know as South Asia. Now, why is it important? Apart from the fact, the usual tropes, which often comes to mind is the number of people that inhabit that region. I mean, India is at 1.4 billion in itself, and Pakistan and Bangladesh are not small countries demographically or geographically. It's a huge landmass, right? But I think there's much more to the story of this subcontinent than just the population size or the capacity, the stakes that are involved when we are looking at South Asia. I mean, we very well understand the stakes involved with the Russia-Ukraine war, where Europe is going. We understand those stakes, bone deep. Where the wars in the Middle East are taking us, we understand them bone deep. But here is a region where there are two nuclear powers who fought a near war, 88 hours of hell in some senses, because no one knew where that conflict will go in May this year. And when they fight a war, it's not a calibrated kind of, it's not a long-term affair. The escalation is so quick that the concern around will this take a nuclear flavor, will this go in that direction, is a ladder that you climb in a matter of days, not weeks or months. So the stakes are very, very high when we are looking at the security of this region, right? In 2020, the Chinese and Indian soldiers, now, again, two big Asian giants. China is a global giant in some senses, right? They fought each other in this part of that map. And here's the 21st century, 2020, two of the largest countries, fastest growing economies, largest armed forces, they're fighting with clubs. They were clubbing each other to death. And you know why? Because in 1993, the two sides agreed that we'll not fire a bullet. So they were like, okay, fine, we'll maintain that agreement, but we'll kill each other nonetheless. The relationship between China and India, we often miss, is a very, very complicated one. Perhaps not as emotive as the relationship between India and Pakistan, as which we know, whether it's about the dispute of Kashmir, whether it's the religious angle that, there's Hindu-Muslim dynamic, communal dynamic between the countries as well. This is a relationship where there are two countries who have a very strong sense of self, and a strong sense of self in the sense that both countries believe they are destined for greatness. They are big powers, they are not just regional powers. So the stakes, not just in the India-Pakistan conflict, but also when the Chinese and the Indians fight, this is a relationship that is going to define the order within Asia, at least in the next 10 to 20 years. Will Asia be a continent that is dominated by the Chinese in material senses, in ideational sense, in financial sense, in economic sense, or will there be a counterweight? A counterweight which can offer a response in kind, both in terms of its geographic size, but also demographic capabilities, manufacturing capabilities. The only country that can arguably fill that or contend in that space is India. So again, a very decisive relationship, and there are global implications of this, right? Who wins the race in Asia? And right now, let's be very clear, China is way far ahead on almost every metric, but where this story goes in the next 2 decades will also have ramifications of the world we live in writ large. And this is a moment where all these conversations about Western decline, about Trump coming in, about the value systems being shaken up, what does democracy truly mean, all those questions are quite rife. What happens in Asia between these two giants will have direct bearing about how we do politics, about how we do society, and the relationships that we have as well. But there is a much more immediate and national kind of, from a British perspective, importance as well. India is a country which has the largest diaspora anywhere in the world. 38.5 million of people of Indian heritage are outside of that country. They are in the US, they're in Canada, they're in the UK, a large chunk in the Gulf, right? In Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Bahrain. What happens to that community of people who are abroad? And so is the Pakistani diaspora quite big, Bangladeshi diaspora quite big. When these countries fight, it has impact on people who have connections with that culture and with that society on their day-to-day lives where they are living. And in Britain, if you look at the numbers of South Asians across the region, there are approximately 4 to 4.5 million people, Brits, of South Asian heritage, just 1.8 million people of Indian heritage. If there is a war, a full-scale war, not an 88-hour kind of war between these two countries, it will directly shape the politics of the United Kingdom. Let me give you 2 very clear examples, right? Usually wars come with economic shocks, as we realized when the Russians invaded Ukraine, right? There are kind of supply line shocks, given how connected the world is in terms of economies. India is one of the most important exporter of pharmaceutical products. A lot of the medicines that you take in your pharmacy now have been sourced from some kind of companies and manufacturing firms in south of India or central India. If there is a war and that supply line gets kind of disrupted, heavily disrupted, the pharmacy outside of Keele University will not have some of the medicines that you need, at least for a brief period of time, and that can have consequences, right? Doctors, a lot of the doctors in NHS are of Indian and Pakistani heritage. It impacts them. So things become very real. So the question when these countries ask about friends and foes is not just in an immediate sense, where does the UK belong when it comes to India and Pakistan? And as someone who served for the last 2 years, I was in the Foreign Office dealing with these issues, and I was looking at when these two countries started fighting from a very official lens. We cannot take those sides very easily. We cannot say that we prefer India over Pakistan. We have to protect our citizens at the end of the day. And that brings the value, the stakes of that region very much in very sharp focus when we start looking at the implications of what can happen to us when something goes south so far away, and which might not be very important to us in terms of our day-to-day lives right now, but will become very important the moment these guys start fighting. So just to give you a sense of the global, the regional, and the national importance of this region, the sinews are very, very strong. And this is not just about India, Pakistan, and China. When in August 2024, Sheikh Hasina, she was ousted in the popular uprising, the impact of that was felt directly in the UK, apart from street protests by people who are linked to that country. Even cabinet ministers in this country came under fire, right? Or serving junior ministers, sorry, there are links there. So again, just to reiterate that this is a region which has a huge significance for the United Kingdom, apart from being a very important part of the world itself. And needless to say, British history in the subcontinent is a complicated one, for obvious reasons, right? There's a colonial history. Now, if you talk to anyone in India today, they don't really look back and say, okay, fine, we're going to go back to what happened in 47 and before and start doing a foreign policy or making a foreign policy based on that memory. In some senses, these countries have moved on quite strongly. But when there is disagreement, when there is geopolitical, diplomatic disagreement, The anger that is expressed in relation to the United Kingdom is in terms of, oh, you are the source of all these problems, something that we hear in the Middle East as well, something that we hear in other parts of the world as well. So the connections are very, very deep, very, very organic, something to be kept in mind. And my final point, when I mentioned India, why do we need to kind of keep this in perspective also from a global vantage, is the fact that here is a country which is one of the most significant non-Western powers, which is shaping the dynamics of what is happening outside of the West in multilateral institutions. So BRICS, I'm sure you have heard of BRICS. It's one of the most it has become a very important platform where Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now the membership has expanded over the last year. They have taken a particular, they think that, especially in an age of Donald Trump 2.0, BRICS can remake the world along different lines that are kind of, in a way that kind of aids the development of non-Western world, so to say. The relationship that we have with China and Russia is very well known. The only country in that sense, in that grouping, which has some weight, which is India, it defines itself as being non-Western but not anti-Western. Now, that makes it a very important partner for a lot of countries in our part of the world to work with, not only to shape the bilateral relationship between UK, India, US, India, but also to leverage that partnership to make sure that the rules-based system that we live in, or that we created after the Second World War, or after the Cold War, is not lost as quick as many people fear that it might be. So that's the first part of my pitch of why this is so important. Now, let's come down to how does this country deal with that geography and its neighborhood. Now, we do know that India has a very, very rough history with Pakistan. The two countries, when they were created in 1947, they were partitioned, right, when the colonial period came to an end. And it was a very brutal, very bloody partition. 1 million plus people were displaced, many people were killed, and the trauma of that is still being carried in the heads and hearts across generations of the communities, and it has become very politicized, right? There's one issue about Kashmir. This whole thing is Kashmir, which is divided between India, China, and Pakistan. India claims the whole of it. Pakistan claims most of it. China claims this part. It's a tripartite problem, right? And it has seen a lot of violence. There are people in Kashmir who would want it to be completely free of all three. So it's not just a tripartite. It's a quartet, if you like. And it's a festering sore of a problem. It's not something that has, which can be resolved anytime soon. So Pakistan, from an Indian vantage, is very clearly in the foe camp. China, sometimes in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was inching in the friendly camp, but over the last 10, 15 years, it has very decisively gone into the foe camp, and I'll come to what is happening from here. And then there are the other countries like Bangladesh, which was friend, and then Sheikh Hasina was ousted foe. How does India do its neighborhood? And this is where it's important to keep in perspective what drives the Indians when it comes to regional geopolitics. And that's where the threshold principle that I mentioned earlier becomes so important. The first and most important things that the Indian government cares about when it looks at this geography is state stability. Is your neighbor and that state stable? Is it a viable state? And this is an important issue, right? A region that has been partitioned so much, which has gone through so much turbulence, of so much want historically, economic poverty, having a viable, functioning state where the contract between the citizen and the state is a healthy one, a representative one, is not always a given. So if you're at Delhi right now and you're looking at Myanmar as of today, this is a country which is at war with itself. There's a multi-sided civil war going on in Myanmar, where the majority and the minority dynamics between the Bamar Buddhists and the Christians and the Muslims who are living on the edges of the country, there are various nationalist movements going on. There was a coup in 2021, and there is a armed resistance against that. That's not a stable state. It's a de facto broken state, and you do not want that. And that is simply because if something goes wrong in Myanmar, if that state breaks down completely, then there will be spillover of that conflict and violence, whether it's in the forms of drugs, increase of drug supply, criminality, migrants, displaced refugees, right? Indians don't like refugees either. So that's because it puts a lot of pressure on on these states which are not very rich in themselves. So you want to make sure that your neighboring state is stable. It does not matter what kind of regime they have, whether it's an autocracy or a democracy. That's a secondary issue. Is it stable? That's the first starting point. Now, if it is stable, it's Bangladesh, it's stable. There was a very rough kind of transition of power that happened last year, but still the interim government came in, led by a former Nobel laureate, Professor Muhammad Yunus, and the interim government was able to somehow keep some things going fine. And that's a good thing from an Indian perspective, right? It's not a complete kind of civil war situation. What is it that you care about after that? Then comes the question of national security. The government that is there in power in your neighborhood, is it willing to respect your national interests as you define it at that point in time or not? Why did India like Sheikh Hasina so much that it is willing to give her asylum even today, even though Dhaka is asking India to send her back after the sentence 2 days back? And that's simply because Sheikh Hasina delivered something very valuable for India. She made sure that Bangladeshi territory was not being used by militants, and they were not being armed secretly by, Bangladeshi government, which has happened in the past under her kind of, command, to use Bangladeshi territory to foment all sorts of violent acts in the northeastern parts of India, where I'm trying to highlight. And that's a very sensitive part of India because for a long time, people in communities in that part of India, whether it was the Naga communities, the Mizo communities, the Assamese communities, they felt that the idea of India, whether it's a secular, liberal India, a Hindu-dominated India as it has come to be today, neither of that idea works for them. They don't want to be part of the Union. They don't belong to the Republic. And they express that anger, they have expressed that anger using violence. And if they can get a safe haven in Bangladeshi territory just across the border, and most of it was for a long time a completely porous border, now heavily fenced, of course, that makes India's national security dynamics, it complicates it hugely. Sheikh Hasina made sure that was not happening. The other thing Sheikh Hasina ensured was that Bangladeshi minority communities, especially religious minorities, Hindus in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a Muslim-dominated country. Hindus in Bangladesh were not being systematically being discriminated against in a very kind of, blunt manner. And that is something that resonated well with India. And the irony of that is, under a Hindu nationalist India, there's a fair argument to be made that, where's the position of, what's the position of religious minorities in India itself, right? Muslims in India, there's a whole critique that they are not being given the due respect that they deserve. But from New Delhi's policy perspective, is the national security being maintained? And there's a reason for that. If minority communities, whether it's Hindus or Sikhs, come under fire in Pakistan or Bangladesh, it will have an emotional repercussion among Hindu communities in India that can then become political, and that will directly feed into complicating the bilateral relationship. And again, we have seen that communal politics take a geopolitical color in the past decades. Something happens to Muslims in India or to Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan and Bangladesh, that is a regional problem, not just a national problem. So that is important, right? So national security becomes a very, very, whether that is respected or not by that government of a stable state is important. No, you would ask me, where does Pakistan fit in all this? Because we know that it's a concern. Even with Pakistan, I would say, and Pakistan has for a long time alleged that India is actually trying to undermine its own national security by secretly supporting all sorts of armed actors, whether they're Islamists, whether they're nationalists, Baloch nationalists or the Pashtun nationalists. Today, Pakistan argues that India is actually working with the Afghan Taliban to support all sorts of proxy actors to foment violence inside of Pakistan. That's the charge officially made. Even with Pakistan, I would argue, today India would not want to see Pakistan that is completely unstable. And that's simply because a fundamentally unstable state in Pakistan would be a much bigger security risk for India than having a Pakistan which is capable, but perhaps might fight with you once in a while. And that's simply because of the reasons I mentioned, all sorts of spillover of conflict and refugees. But, and this is a very important thing, it's a nuclear armed state. You don't want state breakdown in Pakistan, especially given the fact that this is a country which has kind of very highly operational, highly advanced military weapons technology, nuclear weapons technology. So even with Pakistan, the hierarchy of the thresholds stand. State stability is a must. You are an adversary, so we will give you a little bit of grief, but we don't want that to become so much that we are looking at a moment where there are these concerns about nukes going into the hands of non-state actors or terrorist actors. We do not want that kind of instability, even in Pakistan. So, state stability, national security. If these two things are met, then comes the good stuff. Then we can do trade with you. Then we can do business with you, right? Then we want to build a port in Rakhine State of Myanmar. Then we want to have access to a port in Sri Lanka, whether it's a Colombo port or Trincomalee port. Because you're neither a national security threat, nor are you an unstable state which is teetering on the brink. So now we can talk connectivity. And this is where a lot of the recent discourse has been. There is a whole policy that the Indian government curated in the early 1990s called the Act East policy. And the whole idea was that, look, India needs to replicate the East Asian tigers, Taiwan, Singapore, Koreans. If they can grow at the scale and pace that they did, why can't we? And one of the way of doing that is to actually connect India's kind of trade and business communities and markets better to East Asia. And for that, you need to have good relationship with both Bangladesh and Myanmar and a stable northeast of India. When Narendra Modi comes to power in 2014, he changes the name of that policy to call the Act East policy that we have just been looking till now. Now I'm going to act on this. But that's a very important part of India's foreign policy in the region. Connect the region. If in 1947 a partition led to the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh, you need to at least, if not politically, economically undo the partition of that moment. These borders never existed in 1947. They did not exist. So if you wanted to do trade between Lahore and, let's say, Delhi, there was no border. And today you cannot cross the border. So from the Indian perspective is when politics is fine, geoeconomics becomes very important. And let's assume that the geoeconomic story is going very well. Again, Sheikh Hasina is an easy example because India did succeed in increasing the bilateral trade with Bangladesh between 2009 and 2014 by a huge number, right? 2024, the bilateral trade figure was something in the ballpark of $16 billion, which, given the scale of trade that happens between the two countries, or used to happen before, is a sizable amount, right? Not when you look at UK and India, but very important. And then, of course, last year, politics went south when Sheikh Hasina was ousted. So, state stability, national security, economic connectivity, and if that story is also going very well, economic connectivity is also going very well, then the fourth and the final aspect of how India does the region is ask for political inclusivity. And the Indians are very cagey about this. They're not like, they say we don't do democracy promotion the way the Americans did in Iraq or Afghanistan. And the Brits supported them and the NATO supported them. We don't do liberal interventionism. We are not in the business of building democracies out of states which we think will not be democratic in whichever way you define democracy. But it is in our national interest, long-term national interest, that there is some degree of social political equilibrium in our neighboring states, because it goes back to the very first thing of state stability. If that equilibrium is not there, if the Tamil communities of Sri Lanka do not get the right to assert their language as a national language in Sri Lanka, if they are not given adequate representation in Sri Lankan politics, then it leads to conflict. And as we saw, Sri Lanka experienced a huge civil war in the 80s, 90s, right? Till 2009, there was a civil war going on, and the end of it was pretty brutal. I don't know how many of you saw the protests in 2009 at Trafalgar Square by the Tamil communities, British Tamil communities, against the Sri Lankan government. It was a one-sided win where the Sri Lankan army completely obliterated the armed kind of, the Tamil Tigers. This is one of the most potent sort of Tamil nationalist armed outfit that used to exist earlier. That cannot work, is the Indian argument. So you need some degree of political equilibrium, and that is an argument that the government of India today, which is very politically skewed to the right, and has a very kind of Hindu ideological worldview as Hindu supremacy, even they recognize that, look, you cannot just disenfranchise 14% of India's Muslim population. You need an equilibrium. And that is something, that is a conversation that is happening just now. There was a bomb blast recently in New Delhi, and the investigations are still going on, of course. And one of the things that it threw up, for the policymakers is we need to figure out how we do not lose a wider kind of pocket of Indian Muslims to this kind of violence that we just saw pan out in Delhi, near the Red Fort, which is one of the most important symbols of kind of syncretism in India, because the person who did detonate that bomb was a doctor, or was connected to kind of white-collar professionals. So for the Indian government, this was a shocking thing that, look, highly educated people are feeling alienated. And this is a question that has come to, it has taken a new life in India today. That is something that India desires, that kind of political inclusivity, ideally, in its neighborhood. These are the four things in graduation. Again, I'll repeat it: state stability, national security, economic connectivity, political inclusivity, not democracy. That is the threshold principle that determines whether the country is a friend or whether the country is a foe. And this brings me to the final part of my presentation as to where are we. So let's just quickly go through the map and see on the friend-foe matrix where things is. Pakistan is a very straightforward case. It's a foe. In fact, I can confidently argue that right now, both the Indians and Pakistanis are preparing militarily for the next conflict. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and that when could be any moment. They're literally, even today, this morning, there was reports coming in that the Indians lost certain Excalibur kind of munitions during the May conflict. They have replenished it using emergency orders because they know a war is coming with the Pakistanis, right? There could be any trigger, like a terrorist incident that triggered the May conflict. There could be any trigger. So in the foe camp, if we look at China, let me come to China the last, because of a very complicated case. Nepal, I don't know how many of you followed, but there was a complete collapse, a political collapse in Nepal just a few weeks back, wherein the entire political system of course, civilian governments, prime ministers. I think apart from, in the last decade, the country, apart from United Kingdom, which has had as many prime ministers in that period, I think, is Nepal. So it's a weak system. It's a weak polity. It's a weak economy. The main source of economic, revenue source for this country, small country sandwiched between China and India geographically, culturally closer to India, of course, but very weak constitutional undergirding and very weak economy. Remittance flows are the most important part of Nepali economy, and a bit of tourism, right? And otherwise mostly agrarian. Had a complete breakdown of a system of politics. And the Indians were not really getting along with the Nepali leadership that used to be there. So Nepal right now is in a neither friend nor foe category, right? What happens next, it's to be determined in some sense. Bangladesh, of course, after the ouster of Sheikh Hasina, very quickly came into the foe camp. But right now we are at a moment when the Indian government is realizing that you cannot carry on with perpetual enmity with both Pakistan and China and Bangladesh. Then you have a three-front kind of insecure scenario, which is not something that you can sustain if it comes down to that. The friendly categories are, of course, Maldives and Sri Lanka today. And this is, again, a very interesting story because Sri Lanka, too, in 2022, went through a complete economic collapse. The government was completely, in a popular uprising, ousted. Instead of reacting negatively to that, India used that as an opportunity to really make inroads, right? And make amends with the Colombo government. And the government that came to power after the elections in September 2024 last year is a political party that had actually fought against the Indians in the 1980s, a communist left-wing Marxist political party. So if you would have asked me 5 years ago, can these two entities, government in India and the NPP government, the Marxist government that has come to power in Colombo with a huge mandate in 2024, can they get along? 5 years ago, I would say there is no way. They are in the foe camp. But this is where the learning happened in Delhi, that look, state stability is being met. The government is not antithetical to our national security concerns. Do the business. The threshold principle kicked in. So Sri Lanka in the friendly camp, so is Maldives. And look, this is very interesting. Whether it's Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, or Bangladesh, a lot of the domestic politics of these countries took a pro-India or anti-India color, given how big India is and how influential Indian power is, both psychologically and practically and politically, in these countries. So when elections would happen in Nepal, which could be every 9 months at times, the elections will be fought by, is the party pro-India or is the party pro-China? Because China also has something to offer. A lot of money comes from China. Same for Sri Lanka. How do you balance between these two competing Asian behemoths, both of which are throwing a lot of money at you, and with money comes strings attached? Do this, don't do that. We will tell you what, don't get the Chinese submarine dock at your port. Don't get the Indians to invest in a particular sensitive sector. That would be the Chinese ask. How do you balance these two giants? And we have not even come to where the Americans will fit in that equation. That is the fundamental thrust along which the national security dynamics of these countries came to get shaped. Finally, to China. China is the most unavoidable foe for India and one of the most important relationships that it has. In fact, I would argue the British dilemma with China, that it is a security concern. It's a security threat in some senses. It's challenging not just value systems. As I'm sure you have seen in the newspapers yesterday, MI5 is literally giving out advisories of Chinese spying going on in Westminster, and that is happening at scale. So the response has to be at scale. And that's why the advisory, a very unusual advisory, the security service never comes out with this kind of advisory and then put it up in national newspapers. But we cannot live without Chinese kind of economic partnership. If today for the United Kingdom, the growth mission is the central mission, that's exactly the same mission for the government of India. You cannot become a developer, you cannot become a manufacturing power, a manufacturing hub beyond the pharmaceutical industries, of course, without having your supply lines sourced from the biggest global giant of manufacturing, which is China. So security threat, economically hugely dependent. And even the India-China bilateral economic story is a very complicated one. Huge, one of the biggest trading partner of India is China. India is not the biggest trading partner of China, of course, but India runs a huge trade deficit with the Chinese. So you want to do the trade, but you're also getting a really rough deal when you do that trade, because you're importing more Chinese products than you're exporting whatever you have to sell to the Chinese. And that's a strategic problem right now. It's a problem that has started to color the quality of the bilateral itself. And after 2020, there was a very clear moment. This was a watershed moment from an Indian psychological perspective. 20 Indian soldiers were clubbed to death. And that is something that the Indian society was unwilling to accept. The relationship went into a deep freeze. And it took, and I will come back to Trump, because all roads today lead back to Mar-a-Lago, not to White House, Mar-a-Lago. The arrival of Trump 2.0 really complicated India's options. Here's an Asian country, a South Asian country, which actually became one of the most important partners for the United States in the 21st century in Asia, and was a country on which the Americans said, we will put a bet on you, because you are the Asian country that will become the counterbalancing or countervailing force to the Chinese in their backyard. That bet failed, or is seemingly failing, given the scale and pace of China's rise. And India is still it's a rising economy, one of the fastest growing economies, but still not at par with what's going on with China. And when Trump 2.0 comes in, the American policy on China starts to take a holiday. And this has left Indians in a deep lurch. Where are we? Is our one of the most important Western partners. Indians don't do alliances, by the way. They don't do alliances like the way we do. There are no allies. They want to have partners, and when the partnership is over, done, don't come asking for whatever you want to ask for. It's not like the UK-US special relationship, nowhere close, by choice, right? So for India, which has been left completely rudderless with respect to the Americans, dealing with China has become much more important. So what they have done is, despite having lost a lot of territory after 2020, and having accepted that we will not do business as usual with the Chinese, for that reason, India said, I'd rather lose the territory, perhaps, but I cannot trust the Americans right now, so I need to figure out a way to learn to live with the Chinese. And that's what's happened over the last few months, where the Indians are saying that we will try to find a way, if not to do a rapprochement, it's a very complicated relationship, but we'll try to find a way of working with the Chinese, because today we cannot trust the Americans at all. Of course, we'll try to deal with the Americans, but you cannot put trust or faith in Trump 2.0 as someone who can come and partner with you. And there's good reason. The tariff wars that are coming out of the United States, India is one of the highest tariffed countries, 50% tariff rates. Now, America, the US, is one of the most important consumer of Indian export. So the moment the tariffs kicked in, people in Bangalore, people in Hyderabad, people in Chennai and Kochi, I mean, they were literally firms that just shut down. People lost jobs. Those people still don't know how to live their livelihoods. It's not a story that makes headline today, given all that's happening in the world. But there's a very direct impact that is happening. So that makes the value of China even more important. And this is where I would say, on the friend and foe matrix, the Chinese truly are for Indians. You are foes when it comes to national security, but I cannot but be friendly with you for my own economic well-being. And that's a very, very deeply uncomfortable place to truly be in. I'll stop right there. It's exactly 8:10. I've spoken a lot, and I hope you have questions. Do quiz me. It gets, I'll have more insight and more detail to offer. And you can quiz me on any of the countries of the region, not just India. Thank you so much.